I frequently take walks through city parks, as I have been living in a major city for several years. Being an avid pedestrian, I find myself walking almost everywhere, often during nighttime due to my irregular work hours. I vividly recall an incident from a couple of years ago, when I was heading home after picking up some food from a restaurant, about a 10-minute walk away from my apartment. It was nighttime, and darkness enveloped the surroundings. Although the sidewalks were relatively calm, with a decent number of people still out and about, I decided to take a shortcut through one of the nearby parks. Generally, parks tend to be quieter during the night. I planned to walk along a pathway that traversed the park, which featured numerous trees, a small wooded area on one side, and open spaces with benches and tables. The walk would take approximately 5 minutes through this area. On that particular night, barely a minute after entering the park, things grew remarkably silent. I found myself alone in the vicinity. Suddenly, I heard a noise emanating from a dense stretch of woods to my left, suggesting the presence of a large animal. While it seemed plausible, due to the noise originating from the thick woods, I also considered the possibility of it being a person. The sound indicated movement, with whoever or whatever it was venturing a few feet deeper into the woods, and trailing slightly behind me. Although I noticed leaves rustling and branches moving, I couldn't spot the source of the noise. Despite the curiosity, I continued walking, wondering about the identity of the intruder. It struck me as unusual for a large animal to be in that specific section of the woods, but the presence of a person also seemed rather strange. As I proceeded along the path for about 2 more minutes, I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. They were some distance away, perhaps nearly 100 feet, but audible enough to indicate their approach. The more I walked, the closer the footsteps seemed to draw. It became increasingly concerning when the individual behind me sounded as though they were only about 50 feet away. I had been maintaining an average walking speed, certainly not slow. In a quick glance backward, I caught a glimpse of a man, albeit with limited visibility due to the nighttime park environment. He wore a hooded jacket, his face obscured, and his gaze fixed downward. This sight did little to assuage my concerns. If anything, it heightened them. I increased my pace, but the man continued to close the gap. With only about a minute left until I reached the end of the park, I grew anxious to exit into the well-populated city sidewalks. My objective was to escape the park's confines, as I knew that once I reached the sidewalk, there would be other people around. Nevertheless, the man persisted, gradually narrowing the distance between us. By the time I could see the park's exit, he was only 15 feet behind me, accelerating his pace further. Sensing imminent danger, I made a dash for the sidewalk. Reaching it just in time, I watched as the man disappeared behind some trees within the park, relieved to be in the presence of other pedestrians. I wasn't sure of the man's intentions, but I was simply relieved to have distanced myself from him. I continued walking toward my apartment, which was only a few blocks away. After a short time on the sidewalk, I turned onto a quieter street. It took me around a minute to reach my building, and with it in sight, for some unknown reason, I decided to glance behind me. I hadn't heard anything at that moment, but there was an inexplicable urge to check. To my disbelief, the man was still there, but this time he was far away, approximately 100 feet behind me. I couldn't comprehend it. I immediately started sprinting toward my building. Once I made it to the doors, I looked back to find the man walking toward me, now approximately 30 feet away. I swiftly used my key fob to gain entry into the apartment building, ensuring the door closed securely behind me. I didn't wait around to see if the man would attempt to follow. I proceeded straight to the elevator and ascended to my floor. Once safely inside my apartment, I felt a chilling unease. Unable to believe that I had encountered the man again, I approached the window, peering out to check if he was still outside. As expected, he was there, walking away down the sidewalk. Unfortunately, my lack of discretion became evident as he happened to look up and notice me standing there. Hastily, I closed the shades, retreating from the window. Approximately an hour later, when I glanced outside again, the man had vanished from sight. I couldn't fathom his intentions, but I felt relieved that he hadn't gained access to my building. I reside in a peaceful residential area, and one activity I enjoy is taking walks whenever I have the opportunity. Usually, I stroll to the end of my street and then proceed to either explore a nearby road or wander through a local park. Since I work during the day and often feel famished and exhausted upon returning home, I frequently opt to walk at night. Despite occasional eerie moments, I have never been bothered by walking at night because my neighborhood has always felt secure to me. The street has few houses and very little vehicular traffic, and there are no bustling roads in the immediate vicinity. While many people walk their dogs during the day, I usually find myself alone during my nighttime walks. I am acquainted with most of my neighbors, and I have even gotten to know a few individuals from neighboring streets. Everyone is always friendly and welcoming. This incident occurred roughly a month or two ago. After arriving home from work, eating a meal, and taking some time to relax, I felt the urge to go for a walk. Although I don't walk every single day, on average I go for walks 3 or 4 nights a week, depending on the weather. That evening, around 8 p.m, I left my house to begin my walk. To reach the street, I walked down my fairly long driveway. As my property encompasses about 2 acres, which is typical for the area. It's a somewhat untamed region, with a small wooded area in my backyard. Upon reaching the end of my street, I noticed a man who had just turned onto it from another street. I glanced at him for a brief moment, around 2 or 3 seconds, and although he wasn't looking in my direction, I didn't recognize him. It struck me as unusual to see someone walking on the street at that time, especially since I was doing the same. What was even more peculiar was that I didn't recognize him as a resident in the area, so I wondered why he would be strolling down my street. The man was wearing a baseball cap and a sweatshirt, and he didn't make eye contact with me. Since I was already heading in the opposite direction, I continued walking. After a few minutes, I reached a nearby park where I intended to spend some time walking around. It was typically intriguing to explore the park, and on that particular night, I ended up wandering through it for approximately 30 minutes. The park was quiet, and I was the only person there throughout my visit. The only sounds I could hear were occasional squirrels scurrying about, and crickets chirping in the distance. Subsequently, I made my way back to my street, retracing my steps all the way to my house. It took about 15 minutes in total to return from the park. But as I was walking on my street, approaching my house, I heard a sound. When I was approximately 40 feet away from my driveway and could see my front yard, I heard a noise that seemed like an animal running through the yard. It wasn't particularly loud, but it caught my attention due to the overall silence outside. As I looked in the direction of the sound, initially, I didn't see anything. There were several trees and bushes scattered throughout my front yard. I halted my walk, standing in place while trying to locate the source of the noise. Although the sound indicated a relatively large animal, I couldn't spot anything. Taking a few cautious steps forward to investigate further, I eventually caught a glimpse of movement. Despite the darkness, I managed to discern a man partially concealed behind one of my bushes. To my surprise, he appeared to be the same man I had seen walking down my street earlier. This discovery raised some concerns. Why would a stranger be hiding in my front yard? Slowly, I took a few more steps toward my driveway, unsure of what actions to take. Should I continue walking up the driveway and into my house, or should I refrain from doing so? I was genuinely worried about the man's intentions, and I quickly decided against approaching my front door. Instead, I kept walking past my driveway and further down the street, out of the man's sight. At that point, I concluded that I needed to find a way to enter my house. I couldn't just wander around all night. I resolved to attempt accessing my home and continued walking along my street until I reached the yard of a neighbor a few doors down. From there, I passed their house, entered their backyard, and proceeded into a wooded area that extended through several backyards, including mine. Navigating the woods as quietly as possible, I headed in the direction of my backyard. Fortunately, the woods were not densely packed, allowing me to move through them with relative ease and minimal noise. Despite the darkness, I had a general sense of direction and continued in the right path. It took approximately 5 minutes, but eventually, I arrived in my own backyard. As I approached the edge of the woods, my house stood less than 100 yards away. I readied my house keys, and without delay, I sprinted toward the back door. My goal was to unlock it and enter swiftly, hopefully without alerting the man to my presence. However, in hindsight, I realized that running was a mistake. I should have opted for a slow and quiet approach. As I covered a little more than halfway to my destination, I heard a noise coming from the front of my house. It became evident that someone was walking around and approaching my location. Despite the circumstances, I kept running and managed to reach the back door. With a sense of urgency, I unlocked it and swiftly slammed it shut, locking it behind me within a couple of seconds. The man reached the door just as it locked and attempted to open it. I peered through the window and observed his reaction upon realizing that the door was secured. He promptly turned and ran away. I walked to the front of my house to ensure that the man was leaving, and indeed, he sprinted back down my driveway and disappeared from sight as he entered the street. I decided to report the incident to the police, despite the man's departure. Though I didn't expect much to come of it, I felt it was necessary to make a report. Since then, I haven't seen the man again. The whole situation caught me off guard, because I never anticipated such an occurrence in my neighborhood. Despite the incident, I continue to go for walks, but I now exercise extreme caution. Not too long ago, I experienced a peculiar incident while taking a walk. My aim was to reach my daily step goal of 10,000, as tracked by my fitness device. Sometimes, if I haven't accumulated enough steps earlier in the day, I find myself walking at night to meet my target. On this particular night, around 9 o'clock, the weather was pleasant, so I decided to go for a stroll to achieve my step count. While initially hesitant about walking at night, I eventually shrugged off any concerns and decided to go for it. My house is located in a typical, quiet neighborhood, characterized by numerous houses lining the streets. It's part of a large overall neighborhood, with several similar streets. I set off from my house, walking down the driveway onto my street. The night was calm and peaceful, devoid of any other pedestrians at such a late hour. I walked to the end of my street and continued on to the next one, not having a specific route in mind. My only plan was to wander through nearby streets until I reached around 8,000 steps, at which point I would head back home. By the time I returned, I would either have achieved my target or be very close to it. While walking down the adjacent street, I noticed a car turning onto it. Initially, it didn't strike me as odd, so I moved closer to the side of the road since there were no sidewalks available. However, I couldn't help but notice that the car was moving unusually slowly, perhaps less than 10 miles per hour. This raised a slight concern, though it didn't cause too much alarm. As I continued walking in the car's direction, it eventually passed me, but I didn't bother looking over to see who was driving. The car proceeded ahead and turned onto the next street. I carried on with my walk, making my way almost entirely down that street before unexpectedly encountering the same car again. It was still driving slowly, albeit slightly faster than before, and heading in the same direction as me. As it approached from behind, it passed by, but once again, I refrained from glancing over. I proceeded to walk down one more street until I reached approximately 8,000 steps. Satisfied with my progress, I decided to turn around and head back home. To my surprise, as I retraced my steps, I spotted the same car once more. This time, something felt off. Strangely, the car had its headlights turned off, and it was still following me, matching my walking speed, although it wasn't directly behind me. It trailed a short distance away. My suspicion grew, and upon reaching the end of the street, I made a turn onto the next one, my own street, just one over from where I lived. Astonishingly, the car continued to follow. Uncertain of what to do, I stopped and turned to face the car. Mirroring my actions, the car also came to a halt. We both remained stationary, with neither of us making a move. Due to the darkness and the car's distance, I couldn't discern the identity of the driver. Eventually, the car began reversing for a brief distance before executing a full turnaround. It then departed, leaving me perplexed and apprehensive. I wasted no time and swiftly walked back home, expecting the car to reappear at any moment. However, it never did. Arriving home considerably faster than usual, thanks to a mixture of quick walking and jogging, I finally felt safe and secure. I couldn't help but contemplate the motives behind the car's behavior and the identity of the person inside. The story, however, didn't conclude there. Approximately an hour later, While casually moving through my living room, I caught sight of a car parked in my driveway. Headlights were off, and to my alarm, it was the same car. I couldn't determine whether anyone was inside, but the mere presence of the car gave me an eerie feeling. Concerned about potential trespassing, I promptly switched on the outdoor lights in front of the driveway. A mere 10 seconds later, the car's engine roared to life. It backed up, still without its headlights illuminated, and swiftly departed from my driveway. I was relieved to see it go, but a lingering worry persisted, fearing its potential return. Throughout the night, I repeatedly checked the window, but the car never reappeared. Thankfully, I haven't seen it since that night, which brings me a sense of relief. Nonetheless, questions continue to plague my mind. Who was driving the car? Why were they following me? How did they know where I lived? And what was the purpose of parking in my driveway? Regrettably, I have no answers to these perplexing inquiries. Despite the lingering mysteries, I'm grateful that I emerged unharmed from the encounter